All right, welcome everyone to our last faculty-student colloquium of the spring 2021 semester. It's a pleasure for me to welcome everyone. In a moment, I'm going to turn the screen over to Yoshi Alitsky, our PhD student, who has been doing a wonderful job organizing this semester. I just want to take a moment to thank Yosha for all the work to organize this. And I'm very excited to learn from our student, Matheus Rinco, about his research. I will just say that we are very hopeful that in the fall, when we are able to convene again, we'll be able, A, to do this hopefully in person, and B, to be able to provide food. So we owe everybody at least one, if not two lunches for the faculty student colloquia. So with that, I will turn it over to Yosha. Yosha, the screen is now yours.
Thank you, Avi, for the warm opening. Today it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you my fellow student, Matheus Rinco, with whom I really enjoyed studying and learning from him, with him and from him a lot over the past 2 years. Matheus is a man of many degrees. He has graduated from law school in 2014, then seemingly switched the field to Hebrew and Judaic studies and did an MA diploma at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem at 2017, was with us over the past 2 years at UConn and the Center for Hebrew and Judaic Studies. And we are both proud and sad to let him off to the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies for his PhD program at NYU starting in the fall semester. In a way, Matheus' many talents come together today in a synthesis in his talk, on his paper, Legal Competence according to the earliest rabbis. And I'm very excited to hear your insights. We also invited a co-panelist, which is Professor Stuart Miller. Professor Stuart Miller is not only our academic director, obviously, but also the advisor of Matheus, and I'm very happy to have you with us as the renowned expert in the field. And I will also invite you to directly make your remarks, deliver your remarks after Matheus' presentation, and then all of us are invited to ask more and less expert questions to Matheus in a Q&A. With that, Matheus, take it away, please.
Thank you, Yosha, for your very generous presentation. Thank you, Professor Pat, for the initiative. As Yosha announced, I am interested and I'm dealing with legal competence according to the earliest rabbis. By legal competence, we lawyers, mean who is allowed to judge, to adjudicate, who can do that, who is able to do that. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to walk you through first a quick introduction of our main source, the Mishnah, then the overall impression left by the material, the unexamined impression about who is it the rabbis think should be judging. Then we're going to work with one specific text that destabilizes that impression, and then further with one specific word in that text that helps us understand a little better the interaction between rabbis and the adjudicating activity. And finally, I'm going to try and look at some of the implications of that to our understanding of the world the rabbis were a part of. So our main source the main source we're working with today to understand the rabbis is the Mishnah, which is a compilation from around 200 CE of the legal ruminations of the earliest rabbis, the ones flourishing after destruction of the temple to this date of 200. And what the rabbis did apparently was to teach Torah, to teach the traditional understanding and some kind of traditionalist form of Judaism, and especially elaborate on biblical and traditional law. So for instance, biblical law in Deuteronomy establishes that a firstling, the firstborn animal of sheep and cattle, should be offered in the temple as a sacrifice and eaten as a sacred meal. In case the animal had some blemish and that would disqualify it from being offered, then it could be eaten as regular food. Now, at the time of the rabbis, the second part of the injunction here became a little more important, because without the temple, they could not really offer it. So it was the only way to eat these animals to eat it and not transgress Jewish law, was to wait for it to have a blemish and then eat it. Now, the rabbis further elaborate on it, and they say, for example, in our text here, if a man slit the ear of a firstling, it may never be slaughtered. So Rabbi Eliezer. But the sages say, if there arose in it some other blemish, it may be slaughtered by reason of it. The underlying principle here, something the Bible never really talked about, is that, well, yes, a blemished animal can be eaten, but only if the blemish came up by itself. You can't really force it just to make it permissible. But my question is, who did the rabbis count on applying this law and other kinds and other laws of this type? Now, in the Mishnah and in rabbinic literature in general, we have a number of case stories where, in general, you have a confusing halachic situation that is brought to a rabbi, and then the rabbi gives a decision and clarifies the law. It has been argued that doing so systematically, the Mishnah is trying to construct the idea that the rabbi is the sole legitimate source of law, and only the rabbi could be the one applying the law and interpreting it. So in our story here, which is also from the same place in the Mishnah, dealing with the firstborn, we have a story about children. They were playing, and they decided to be a little cruel to the animals, and they tied their tails together, and the animal ended up getting his tail torn away, and it was a firstling, so it became therefore blemished. The question is, however, does it count as a blemish that comes by itself, or is it on purpose? Because children, being minors, don't really count in what they do. Doesn't count legally, right? So the matter comes before the sages, and they say it is permitted. It really doesn't count. So here, once again, we have this idea, and this happens many times in the Mishnah, where you have a case, the rabbis answer, and the assumption here is that, well, who's applying the law? The rabbis are applying the law. That is an assumption that is also present in other passages, including Masechet Avot, which in its very first Mishnah has, after the chain of tradition that goes back to Moses, has us 3 directives: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around the law. Now, who is it that raises disciples and deals with the law, at least understanding the law? The rabbis. And that deliberating in judgment, meaning not rushing to a decision, is also told to rabbis, makes it look like the rabbis are the ones who are judging. In the same chapter in Avot, we have an advice to how to deal with the suitors, meaning when they're before you, they're both wicked, don't show favoritism to anyone, and when they leave, they're both righteous because they have accepted the judgment. Again, this is directed apparently to rabbis, and therefore rabbis are the ones expected to be judging. That's why it is a little problematic when back to Bechorot, we have this passage. If one that was not skilled judged a matter of law and declared exempt him that was culpable, or declared culpable him that was exempt, or declared unclean what was clean, or declared clean what was unclean, what he has done cannot be undone, but he must make restitution from his own property. But if he was a skilled person approved by the court, he need not make restitution. Now, what is surprising about this is that, for example, in today, nowadays, if we find out that a judge who made a decision was, first, if it's wrong, you can appeal to it. But if you find out that a decision was made by a judge who was not supposed to do it, who was not qualified to do it, the decision is null and void. The rabbis not only say that there's no appeal here, but they say that what was done, the decision is valid. And since we're talking about a person who is not an expert, we're probably talking about a non-rabbi. I mean, we're definitely talking about a non-rabbi. There's an exemption for a person who is skilled. And for the moment, we can assume that this person is somehow connected to the rabbis. And this idea that there's an exemption may make it look like the rabbis are somehow discouraging non-experts from judging. That's why they're making this law that, well, you have to make restitution if you make a wrong decision. That would somehow discourage people who would want to make a decision, but they don't feel comfortable enough, so because they're not rabbis. And that would actually play out well with some of the assumption in the scholarship nowadays that the rabbis were not very much connected to the rest of the other Jews, and that they were in competition with other groups. And there was actually a problem here, a strife. There was opposition between the rabbis and everybody else, and the rabbis are somehow trying to control it and discourage people from doing what they don't want. What the problem is that also supposes that the rabbis would have the power to enforce it, and that's how they would make it so that people don't do what they don't. So here they would have the power to make people make restitution. However, when we look a little further in the same Mishnah, we have another story, a story that reveals to us how the rabbis imagine something like that would happen. How did these cases work? So it happened once that Rabbi Tarfon fed the dogs with a cow whose womb had been removed. Now, according to biblical law, a mortally wounded animal cannot be eaten. So Rabbi Tarfon is saying here that if a cow had its womb removed, it can no longer be eaten because it's not kosher anymore. That's the idea. And the matter came before the sages, and they declared it permitted. Rabbi Tarfon just made a faulty judgment. What's the consequence? He himself recognizes. Rabbi Tarfon said, "There goes thine ass, Tarfon. You're going to have to sell your donkey because you're going to have to pay this person for their cow." Rabbi Akiva said to him, "Rabbi Tarfon, you are exempt because you are a skilled person approved by the court. And he that is a skilled person approved by the court need not make restitution." Now, the problem or the interesting thing about this story is that there's no one forcing Rabbi Tarfon to do anything. It's not like the sages who just told him he was wrong are saying, well, now you have to pay. Rabbi Tarfon himself is the one doing it. He's the one saying, well, I'm going to have to pay. And if you're not convinced that this shows that it is supposed to be voluntary, that the rabbis imagine compliance to their rule here to be voluntary, just look at Rabbi Akiva. Again, he's not directing himself to people who are forcing Rabbi Tarfon to comply. He's directing himself to Rabbi Tarfon himself. So the depiction here is of voluntary compliance. And if that's the case, then the law is not really directed to outsiders with whom the rabbis would probably be in competition. It is directed to people who were already part of the rabbinic sphere of influence. And if that's the case, then what does that mean? Now, if the rabbis wanted people who were already under their influence not to judge, they could do as they do a couple of Mishnayot ahead and say, well, when you do it, it's null and void. It doesn't work. It's not valid. That's what they do when somebody has been paid to judge. Now, this is not necessarily bribery. It's just that they got paid to for the activity of judging. And if that happens because it's so close to bribery, then it's null and void. So the rabbis had at their disposal the technique of declaring a judgment void. So why is it that when it comes to a person who is not skilled, a person who doesn't know the law probably, they don't do it? Why is it that they recognize it as valid and they make it stand? To further complicate the issue, we have at the end this whole idea that if a skilled person, what the word in Hebrew is mumche, if a mumche does it, a mumche lebetidin, a mumche for the court or to the court, if he makes this wrongful judgment, he doesn't have to make restitution. And as I said before, we were working under the assumption that this is a rabbi. There's only one problem. Rabbis are not called mumchim or experts in other situations. There's no equivalence between rabbi and mumche. In fact, the word used to describe a rabbi in general is sage, chacham. So for example, again, back to Masechet Avot, we have this idea that your house should be open to the sages, to the rabbis, so that you will learn from them and will not be thirsty. The one activity, or at least one of the activities that the rabbis do claim for themselves, and they think it is absolutely necessary to have a rabbi involved, is annulment of vows. Now, this is very much also a very much rabbinic injunction that you don't really see that in the Bible, and the rabbis themselves recognize it. But a person who made a vow and wanted to have it annulled could go to a rabbi, and the rabbi would ask questions to basically find out if had these people known the consequences of their vows, if they would have taken the vow anyway. And since they will find out the situation where they wouldn't, then the rabbi is able to retroactively make the vow null because it was made under faulty assumptions. But for that, you need a rabbi. And for that, the Mishnah says, they calls it a sage, a chacham. So for example, on Nedarim, which is the tractate that deals with the rules about vows, you have the idea that there's a special situation, doesn't really matter which one, that such a one may break his vow without recourse to a sage, meaning that in general, you need to reach out to a sage to have a vow annulled. Now, all of this is just to say that a mumche is not necessarily a rabbi. If the rabbis wanted to say that a rabbi is exempt, they would have said a sage, chacham. They don't, they say mumche. And more than that, if we go back to Masechet Bechorot, where our law is to begin with, we will see that the mumche appears more than once, not necessarily a mumche for judgment, an expert for judgment, but an expert. Because you need to, according at least to one opinion, you can only eat the firstborn animal after an expert has said, okay, this really is a blemish, it can be eaten now. There's one passage in Bechorot 4:5, which is just after the one source we were looking first, that says, if a man takes payment for inspecting firstlings, none may slaughter it at his word, unless he was as skilled as Illa in Yavne. Now, Illa is identified with he's said to be a mumche. He is a mumche. Now, it's Illa, it's not Habi Illa. It's not Rabbi Illa. So it's not really clear if he's part of the rabbinic movement or not. We can't really conclude based just on this that he is not part of it, because some early sages are not called rabbis. Hillel, for example, is never called Habi Hillel in Tannaitic literature. A different passage, however, has it that presents some of the blemishes that allow a person to eat a firstborn, and says, these blemishes did Illa recount in Yavne, and the sages agree. Moreover, he added 3 others. They answered, we have heard these ones, we didn't hear the other ones. And in this passage, Illa stands against the sages, meaning he is an outsider to the rabbinic establishment. So it really looks like that a person who is not a rabbi can be a mumche, at least to some other activities. And this is also the impression you have from other passages. For example, when dealing with the idea of the limits of a city, the rabbis say, the Mishnah says that they may only measure at the hand of one that is skilled, of a mumche. Now, here we're not talking about rabbinic law, we're not talking about halacha, we're just talking about measuring. And to be skilled here really means to be skilled. It is a person who knows what they're doing. It's not rabbinic training we're talking about. Maybe some other type of training, but it's not rabbinic training. The same thing we can see from Tosefta Avodah Zarah 3.2, where it says that tefillin, phylacteries, should only be bought from a skilled one. Again, a person apparently who is used to doing it, who knows what they're doing, and this is not necessarily a rabbi. There is no straight way connection between rabbi and a person who writes and makes tefillin, especially because a person who'd be doing it would probably be somehow connected to the scribal profession, and that was, although rabbis could be scribes, there was definitely no equation. So the fact is, a mumche, an expert, when it comes to other activities in the Mishnah, doesn't really have to be a rabbi. It can be anyone who's used to doing that. Now, who is it that could be judging that? Who is it that could be used to judging? Again, when we look at Mishnah Sanhedrin 1 and 3, we have the following injunction. Cases concerning property are decided by 3 judges. Each suitor chooses one, and together they choose yet another. The Mishnah goes on to discuss how exactly these 3 judges are selected, but what matters is that a little further, we are told who cannot be a judge. And these are a dice player, a usurer, a pigeon flyer, traffickers, and seventh-year produce. Now, nowhere in the Mishnah here we hear that a person has to be a rabbi to judge, which means that according to rabbinic literature, anybody can be a rabbi to judge. Anybody can be a judge, and except for these specific figures here. And if that's the case, then anybody can become accustomed to judge and become experienced in judging, and anybody can therefore be an expert in judging and be a target of the rabbinic exemption that we looked before. So my conclusion is that the rabbis were, for some reason, not fighting against the judging that was happening not under their auspices, but they were actually fostering it. They were saying, if you do it, it is going to be valid, even if you do it wrong. But in case you are not a person who is accustomed to do it, who the public is accustomed to see doing it, then you're going to have to pay it. So what lends authority here for this judgment and validity to this judgment is not rabbinic knowledge of rabbinic law or membership in the rabbinic movement, but the position or the being accustomed or accepted by the public to do so. Now, what are the implications for that? Why would the rabbis do it? Why would they be so open to other people doing what much of their literature seems to imply they wanted to do or they thought they should be doing? Well, one possibility is just that they didn't really have control. They couldn't fight it. So they just decided to let it go and go with the flow. Another possibility is that they wanted to integrate themselves and their rabbinic law to what was happening on the ground, to make it so that judgments by people who were not doing what the rabbis wanted or not judging according to rabbinic law would not be valid, would be somehow schismatic. They would be separating themselves from the public, and they probably didn't want that. But it could also be something else. It could be a desire to foster something that is over and against the Roman courts that are available there. And in other places, and this is the next step in my research, we see that the rabbis have some anxiety about Roman courts. So what I'm saying is that whereas some of the scholarship sees an opposition between rabbis and other Jews and other groups, I think that they're much more worried about the Roman courts. That's their, or at least they would be worried about both, but since they're more worried about the Romans, they let it go and foster whatever else is going on. Another stage in my research is to look at rabbinic interpretations of biblical verses that deal with the institution of judges. For example, Exodus 18, where Moses' father-in-law advises him to establish a judicial system. There you have a list of characteristics that Moses should be looking for. And I think that the rabbinic interpretation of that will help us understand what they thought a judge should be like. Should he be a rabbi, or could he be somebody else? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matheus, for your wonderful and critical review of the early rabbis' authority over legal matters. I'm not the expert on the matter, so I gladly directly hand over to Professor Miller.
Can I?
Okay, so most of my comments are going to be general, and the specific comments, some things that Matheus may want to investigate further. First of all, I think you all can see that this is a very involved topic, one that easily can lend itself to a PhD dissertation. And it's also a very worthy one, whether Matheus decides to pursue this at NYU or not, somebody ought to. So, of course, I'm not unbiased in this assessment because it touches so much upon my own work. And although I've argued with, or have contended with Matheus that I think this topic is derived somewhat from his previous life as a lawyer, he insists that that's not the case, that he's completely renounced that life and at this point doesn't even want to remember that he ever was an attorney. But nevertheless, I'm skeptical about that. But at any rate, it's a great topic. And for those of you who don't know, I work in Roman Palestine, the land of Israel, that society, and I purposely bounce between those ways of labeling it precisely because of the debate that's going on right now. So I want to shed a little bit more light on that, which was part of what Matheus alluded to, and then get to some specifics. So for the last couple of decades, there's been, well, going back to the last century, actually, at the last third of the last century, since the Nusnerian school kicked in, there were all sorts of doubts about how much influence the rabbis had in Roman Palestine on things Jewish in general. That morphed into an extreme revisionism at the beginning of the 21st century, brought on by a book written by Seth Schwartz, who's now at Columbia University, in which he contended that in the wake of the disasters of 70 and 135, the first revolt and the second revolt, the first revolt leading to the destruction of the temple, and the second one, the Bar Kokhba revolt, that Jewish life was hard pressed to be resuscitated, and in fact, all but disappeared, just about disappeared in Israel. And that was news to most of us who work in Talmudic literature, who have read the Mishnah and the Tosefta and know these works, which he does too. But of course, he was going against the grain and saying that, you know, this was a idealized world of the rabbis, and the rabbis really, if you count them and you look at them more closely, and work at this point by Catherine Hesser and others showed that the rabbis were a limited group, certainly in numbers. And so not only in terms of influence, but in reality, they didn't add up to a whole lot. And you had to wait until the 4th century and the Christianization of the Roman Empire till the rabbis somehow emerge as this very successful movement that's going to determine what Judaism is going to look like for all time. So a lot of us thought this was really rather radical, and I am one of those who've taken a more moderate view, one that's I believe is more accepted in Israel certainly, and among more sensible scholars, I would like to contend. So that view is that you have to look at much more than the rabbinic evidence. And when you read the rabbinic evidence, you have to read it against the grain to hear those other voices. You have to read it bottom up. You have to stop looking at the rabbis as if they're dictating the terms of the society in which they live. That's what Matheus is trying to do. He's trying to do this with a term that didn't even occur to me to investigate, the term mumche. So this is an important new approach, new avenue to investigate this. But the other thing you have to do is look at the archaeological evidence. And the archaeological evidence points to the sustaining of Jewish life, although attenuated to a large extent after the revolt, which is exactly what you would expect. But we have ritual baths, we have stone vessels, which for some are an indication of purity, because the rabbis view stone vessels as impervious to impurities. We have the emergence of synagogues in a greater way than before the destruction of the temple. We have iconography of different types. We have menorot at Sipari, we have on vessels right into the 3rd century. So the question really is, where do the rabbis fit into all of this? And so the more moderate view is that the rabbis are part of a larger society and are maybe attempting to regulate and institute their views, oftentimes projecting their views on that society, but they're not alone. They're not these tiny little circles trying to be Jews, and otherwise rabbinic Judaism just wouldn't have come to anything. So that's it in a nutshell. I mean, there's much more to this story. So what Matheus is doing here in examining mumche is trying to hear those overtones of that society. Now, we know there are competing jurisdictions here, there are competing courts, and we also know from documents that we have from the late 1st and into the 2nd century that Jews are going to other courts, and that the rabbinic system is not necessarily being implemented, that it's really coming into being. And I think that that's what you have to keep in mind. The rabbis, for lack of a better word or term, are a movement, and movements don't come about because somebody decides to have a movement. They evolve, and these rabbinic circles will morph into a more substantial and better formulated agenda as time goes on. And I don't disagree that becomes more important and more recognized as you move into late antiquity. There's no argument about that. The only question is what happens at the tail end of the Tannaitic period, which is what Matheus is dealing with, and what happens in the Amoraic period that follows in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And so what Matheus is looking at in the mumche is that voice of other experts that the rabbis, the question he's asking is, are they compelled to recognize them? Are they trying to project their influence on these mumchim and incorporating them into their system? I want to suggest that instead, this is a natural process, that they're not thinking in any of those terms. And I think that that's oftentimes the problem when you're trying to project upon people in the past motives that they just don't have, that they're just rolling with the punches. And so that's one big question I want to put out to you, Matheus, that what is happening here is a movement is just naturally developing over time, and that the rabbi's legal system is developing. They are responding to ritual purity practices that they see in the field, so to speak. They're responding to different judicial practices that they're seeing. I've written that they respond to various marital practices in terms of ceremonies and celebrations and so forth. They are just reacting to life around them. And I don't think this is as conscious necessarily or as focused. The rabbis are extremely focused on what they're doing, but the question was whether they understand the ramifications and they've got some platform or agenda is just too modern approach to all of this, to my mind. So that's the big question. And I'll just end with just an observation. I made a bunch of notes here, but I want to let other people talk. But there's just a small observation that I realized when you were presenting the Mumche as an expert and as a lay expert who is not necessarily or probably not at all related to the rabbis. It occurred to me, since I wrote about it, that the term Rav and Rabbi are actually derived from Semitic terms that refer, in fact, to experts and not yet teachers of Torah. Of course, I argue that rabbis, whether they're in inscriptions or in the literature that we have, are experts in the Torah. But you know, Jesus is more informally called my master, my rabbi, and you have instances in rabbinic literature where Rav and in Syriac and so forth, where these terms are used for professional attainment and not necessarily for teachers of Torah. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Miller. That certainly helped to see Matheus' presentation in the broader context. I suggest to proceed that we will take 2 or 3 questions from you and gather them and then hand the word back to Matheus.
So, yeah, could I follow?
Please.
Yeah. So just to follow up on Dr. Miller, so I had the same kind of question in my mind. What's the background, the political background that all this is happening? What are the other options for me if I have a problem? Is there any archaeological evidence of what the Roman leaders had and what kind of cases were being taken care of by Roman courts if I had an argument over property or whatever else? What are my other options? So we're kind of coming from a microcosm of the rabbis, but they're within a bigger context. So if you could add to that a little, I think that'd be interesting.
Thank you very much. I think, Sebastian, you were the second person to have your hand up.
I think Jeffrey did, but it's fine. I mean, it goes in the same direction as what Eitan was saying. I would like to hear a little more about the Roman context and the Roman courts, and you know, in the Batei Din were Mumche involved there, and was there any kind of exchange in terms of who can pass judgment? I would just be not between the Romans and the Jewish law, but within the Jewish population.
Thank you, Sebastian. Jeffrey, apologies for not seeing you in time. Go ahead.
Oh, that's no problem. First of all, Matheus, thank you very much for a really interesting presentation, very provocative, and I appreciated it. So a couple of, I don't know if they're related questions, but as a relative novice in the particularities of this moment, but some observations. First of all, what's interesting to me is the examples that you cited where a mumche is invoked, I think without exception represent a very kind of specialized knowledge, right? There's sort of technical knowledge involved, whether it's as a kind of animal husbandry knowledge, how to recognize when an animal has been deliberately maimed or was accidentally or born with a defect, how to properly inscribe and create the tefillin. These are all very technical kinds of skills. And so I wonder whether there is some way of distinguishing between a rabbinic authority, which is a much more broadly based notion of authority that covers, the Shisha Sidrei Mishnot covers a vast array of different kinds of expertise or knowledge, as opposed to these highly specialized areas of knowledge. And then the second, with respect to the Mishnah itself, is whether there's anything relevant here about the transition from a set of legal developments and discussions that are primarily oral to one that is ultimately written. And once it becomes written, it is disseminated in ways that are no longer rooted in the specific expertise of the teachers who are teaching them, but instead the text is out there for people to study and to deploy as they want. So those are my two questions.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Avi, you also want to add one?
Well, yeah, one very, very quick question, and thank you, Matheus, and thank you, Stuart. And it's a really fascinating discussion. This term mumche, I'm just curious in terms of the etymology of the term. I mean, in modern Hebrew, we have sort of hitmachut, if you want to get an expertise in something, but where do you see this term first appearing? Can you trace sort of its evolution over time in terms of how it's used? And it does remind me, and again, Stuart said we're not talking about contemporary legal analogies, but it does remind me of how one might use an expert witness in a courtroom to refer specifically to certain cases where legal expertise doesn't work, but you need somebody, as Jeffrey was saying, who can talk to you about animal tales or whatever it might be, that expert witness. So, but mumche, where does this come from?
Susan, I did see your hand, but I want to give the chance to Matheus to respond first, if that's okay with you.
Okay, so let's go by parts. Well, first, what are the options in the Roman context? That's actually what made me ask these questions, meaning how was this working, and why were Jews really going to the Roman centurion to ask for a solution for their problems? And at this moment in Roman law, there is a transition, and I think it's also part of the problem here, that in the past, Roman law would have first a praetor deciding, okay, so these are the questions that the judge is supposed to address, and then the suitors would just ask they would choose the judge themselves, much like we saw in the Mishnah. Now, during the Roman Empire, we moved away from that, and we started having more and more centralized and state officials doing that job of judging. However, Roman law also always recognized arbitration. So, but the difference is that arbitration doesn't really have to follow Roman law. It depends on the character of the arbiter and what he thinks is the right thing to do over there, right? So these are the options they have. They have the options of the Roman officials, which maybe are not really that much interested in solving the problem of Reuven stealing Shimon's cow. So they might just send them to the rabbis or to any other local figure. Arbitration, where they could be choosing anybody, including rabbis. And there was also the cities in Galilee that had that were recognized as polis. They had polis-like institutions. They had some councils that also had some communal leaders who would probably also be sought after to solve problems between their members or members of the community. So you had all these options, and they were sometimes competing against each other, but maybe also cooperating just to alleviate the burden of the officials there. The question about the mumche and specialized knowledge, if the rabbis have a broader knowledge, it's interesting because when we look at most of the cases the rabbis do solve in the Mishnah that they are involved, the Mishnah brings cases that are very much also connected to specialized and technical knowledge, but of biblical and rabbinic law. So in a sense, they're not opposed. It's not like the rabbis are dealing with more with a broader area of knowledge. They seem to be dealing with also very specialized questions. And I also think that the other examples we have in the Mishnah and in the Tosefta show that it's really any professional, any person who really has a specialized knowledge of any area. So it's not only these specific areas like the tefillin. And I think the idea of the person who's measuring the city this is pretty much like an engineer. It's not connected at all to general rabbinic or biblical law. It's just measuring. Now, for the etymology of mumche, that is a question that is complicated, at least as far as I've gone into, and I have, because the word seems to have to do with striking or getting out, something getting out or selecting, and the usage moves from that to being something that is used a lot, that's being experimented as the thing itself. So there's the idea in a different passage in the Talmud where they're discussing the idea of the amulet by a mumche, that you can't wear everything on the Sabbath. It has to be clothes, or it has to be something special. And so they're discussing, well, you can wear an amulet by a mumche, and you cannot wear a regular amulet if you're sick and you're trying to get yourself healed through this amulet. And the Talmud says, what is a mumche? It's somebody who has cured 3 people. So it's experimented. It's something that has been used. But I'm not really sure how we went from striking or drafting out to usage, and from there to, and I think from there to experiment is more clear. But yeah. Did I answer everybody?
Wonderful, thank you. So now, Professor Einbinder, please, your question.
Thank you, Matheus. It was a pleasure. It was also nice to see you find another animal passage that I've always loved in the Mishnah, those poor goats with their tails tied together. But yeah, this is a little mushy, so I'll try to give you a clear question out of it. But for most of what you were talking about, it seems to me from your argument that the rabbi's gain is two-way. It's not an either-or argument. That what they're dealing with downwards, as it were, or into the Jewish community is are circles of artisans, right, or professionals, experts, right, whether they're or paraprofessionals, whether they are people with engineering skill or slaughtering, butchering skills, right, or winemaking skills, or whatever the skill is going to be, and they are essentially, if I understand you, inserting themselves as another layer, right? They're limiting the autonomy of those experts to render judgment by themselves. You can't just have the engineer say, you know, yeah, I say that mikveh is going to last 1,000 years, right? You now have to actually defer to a rabbinic authority to get a kind of approval on it, right? And looking upward or outward to the Roman courts, they have the same gain. The Roman courts can't just call in a slaughterer, right, or a Jewish professional, right, and say, well, what do you think about that, you know, goat, right? And they have to go through the rabbi to get to get to get the information, an opinion on what the expert has already told the rabbi, right? So they have essentially is almost like our sort of HMOs, our health care organizations, which are not really about health or care, but they have essentially inserted themselves into the system, right? So that you can't traffic on the road without going through them, right? So I think what you're saying, what you're arguing to me sounds really intriguing, that this is a kind of way of solidifying their own sense of identity, right, as a professional group themselves, right? My question is, and I wonder, it's not my period, but I know, for instance, in the Middle Ages, regulation of meat markets is a really constant source of friction between Jews and Christians. And Bill Jordan has written about this, and I can send you the reference. But I wonder if there's a way, there must be, right, a way to look at guild organization in Roman law, right, and get some sense of where the friction might be between the Jewish mumche and his counterparts among non-Jews. And so on that sort of theme, I guess my direct question is more about the examples that you used in the beginning, which seemed to me to be not so much about legal competence, but about creating a kind of judicial immunity for the rabbis, right? That whatever they do, mishalem lo mishalem, right? Who pays and who doesn't? Whatever they do, they can make a mistake and they're not penalized for it. That's pretty amazing.
Thank you, Professor. I will allow myself to pigtail with one question from me. Tiny question, maybe going back to the 4 professions which are negated in one of your sources. I don't remember exact wording, but the one on the pigeons and the other on the dice throwers. And I wanted to ask how you read those 4 professions. Is it a matter of morality or of kashrut or of trustworthiness? Like, why, for what reasons exactly are they being excluded from the job? Thank you, Matheus.
All right. So Professor Einbinder. Well, I think what's going on is the rabbis are carving for themselves an identity here, but I don't think they're getting immunity for themselves. And I think that that's what's amazing about this passage is that if the mumche is not a rabbi necessarily, then it means the rabbis are recognizing immunity to people who are not members of their groups and who are not a part of their circles and who are nevertheless judging, and they're saying, yeah, their judgment stands and they're immune, they don't really have to pay. Now, why would they be doing that? Professor Miller has suggested it's just what's natural here, but I think it's amazing, and I think that there has to be a reason, especially because it's striking that they would be willing to let go of the well-being of the parties here who got wronged and give these people immunity, especially if these people are not rabbis. Now, I think what you said is really part of it. It is a way for them to carve for themselves a place and identity in the system, but they do so by recognizing that they really can't mess with what's at place already. So they accept it, and they say, it's like, we accept you, please accept us too. In a sense, it's a quid pro quo. It's an attempt to have for themselves a place there by recognizing the place that others already occupy. And I hope I have answered your question. And the role of people who cannot testify and who cannot be judges, it really is a kind of a mystery. I think the traditional commentators see that as a matter of trustworthiness. People who are involved with those practices are just thugs. However, there is a work of one Israeli scholar that recently has suggested, I think her name is Monikenda, but I have to check that and send it to you later. She has suggested that that's actually a reflection of the Roman laws of witness, and they reflect the same sort of concerns that we had in Roman law about who was a upstanding citizen and who could be a part of the of a court or who could testify.
Thank you for your responses. Do we have any other questions or remarks? If not, I will then allow myself to use those moments, because I believe, yes, you did have your graduation and the very kind words of Professor Miller last week, but I guess we won't get back together once more to fare you well to NYU. I remember when we started in our first semester and we started studying Hebrew, you already in the first semester, your Hebrew was more fluent and better than mine, but it was still in a way in one class or comparable. And over the past 2 years, I've seen not only your Hebrew, but your Jewish studies literacy take off to very new and very far from me and my knowledge heights and stratas. And I wanted to applaud you for that. And not only is it your knowledge, but it's what is, I guess, even more important and crucial, that it has always been a good experience and pleasure to learn and study with you. And I always knew that I could address my questions to you, and you had a way of explaining them to me, being grounded in the research field of today, that made you a real and wonderful partner in those 2 years. And I really wish you all the best. And I think the Scoville department should be very happy to have you next year on.
Congratulations, Matheus. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your words, Yosha. I was really fortunate to come to UConn and to be a part of the Center for Judaic Studies and Modern Jewish Life, and I can only thank you for everything you've done for me. Thank you so much.
I think we have commenced a new tradition here, which is that our graduating MA student will be able to make a culminating presentation, and we will quote in the name of Rab Matheus in the future of this new tradition. So thank you for launching us, and I think we know that so you will be coming back. We will invite you back because we owe you lunch, so you'll have a chance to come back and present, and we'll get to see how you continue in your PhD research. Thank you so much, Matheus. And maybe we should all unmute for a round of applause.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Yosha. This is a wonderful new tradition. So I hope we're all able to do this together in person in the fall, or maybe some hybrid format in the fall, in person and online. Great.
Thanks, Yosha, for moderating.
My pleasure. Have a good summer, everyone.
All right, everybody be well.